Los Angeles. I am your host tonight, Raimundo Perez, a member at 1209. And tonight we'll be talking with Erick Cedeño, who is a cross-the-country bicyclist. And we're going to see and learn a lot about his journeys from within the United States and where he's going to go from there to the North Pole. Erick, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, thank you for coming. What I really was impressed about your journeys was how it's centered around the bicycle. And you educated me a lot today about the origins of the bicycle. And there's things that we take for granted about it, but throughout the history, especially the history that you're attuned to, the actual methodology behind it was created during these times. And what we know today was stuff that they were just barely discovering. And so I would love to start with your past and how you got into being a bicyclist.
This is probably 2010. I was living in Philadelphia, and I was like, I don't need a car. I live downtown, and I work downtown, and I was like, why do I even have a car? I should just sell my car and just commute by bicycle, and that's how I started. Years later, I went back home to Miami, where I grew up, and I went from Miami to Key West. It was the longest trip that I've ever done on a bicycle. It's about 155 miles.
Wow.
I went there one way, and the next day I came back. So I did 155 miles one way, 155 miles the other way. When on the bike, I never listen to music. I'm just listening to my thoughts. And one of the thoughts I had was, I wonder if I could travel the whole country by bicycle. And I've done so in 14 years. Every year, I decided to take 30 days or 50 days to do a particular route in the U.S. My first trip was from Vancouver, Canada to Tijuana, Mexico, along the Pacific Coast Highway. And I fell in love with traveling by bike. I love waking up in different places every day. And on that particular trip was amazing because you're hugging the coast and you see whales, you see dolphins, you see sea lions.
It does seem like an opportunity to get close with nature and 100%. Then learning a lot about your place within it. Did you have anyone that inspired you, or was it really just the fact that you were in traffic all the time and you just wanted to get out of the car and onto a bike?
Yeah, it was that. I just wanted to... That trip in particular was, I wanted to do something epic in my life. I was like, I wonder if I do one trip, that was it. It was supposed to just be Vancouver, Canada to Tijuana, Mexico.
Okay.
And then I just fell in love with the lifestyle. I fell in love with the adventure.
So it sounds like you literally just stepped outside and it was like an instant love just to experience what nature was like.
100%, not only nature, but also engaging with people every single day, engaging with different people that I've never met in the past. And I always wanted to pay homage to the way people travel in the past, so I never carry a GPS. I only travel with a map.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
And when you encounter different people, this is across different state lines, what was that experience like? Because, when we look about what's happening in other states, we're just getting it from the news, but to actually see people in person and talking to them, what did you learn from that experience?
Well, the first thing I saw was like, wow, people are really kind along the way. My friends and family were like, dude, you're crazy. You're going to get killed. Like, why are you doing this?
Right.
Like, I remember my older brother, told me, like, you have a college degree. Like, why don't you just find a job and make a lot of money? Like, why are you biking and camping all over? Like, and I didn't have an answer. Not then. I do have an answer today. But what I told him was, like, I don't know why, but I'm just following my heart. And it felt good to travel. Right. And meet all these people. And people were really kind along the way.
And you found that the majority of the people were that way? All of the people?
I would say all the people.
Okay.
I have never encountered anything negative, at least in my face. Maybe behind me, but in my face, people were really kind. As an example, one time I went from New Orleans up to Toronto by bicycle, and I was going through this small town in Alabama. I'm almost sure they never seen a guy with long dreadlocks and but this guy, I went into the campsite and he was like, "Hey, what are you up to? Where are you going?" So I'm started in New Orleans and I'm heading up to Canada. And I'm retracing a particular route of the Underground Railroad. And he was like, "You know what? I cannot benefit from what you're doing. This is a spiritual trip for you. So you're going to be our guest. I want you to find the best camping site, which is by the river. And tonight, once you set up, come to my house. You're going to be our guest. We're going to make dinner for you." Look, this is not just one time. This has happened many times. We could be here till tomorrow telling the story
really
from all the
inspiring.
states that people are like, "Oh, today you got to try, we make the best iced tea in the country." That kind of stuff, right?
Right.
Like people are just kind along the way.
And I imagine this is across race and gender, just diversity of people that you come across in any state.
Yeah, it was so great that I stopped watching the news.
That's how I feel. I feel a lot of what we're exposed to generates a lot of fear, and that it's not necessarily reflective of how the world is. And to be able to confront that, to actually go out there and be vulnerable against it and then find different truths, I find really admirable. And I do think those truths are valid. I think we learn a lot more about ourselves that way in return. So when you're talking with all these people, and in this specific case, you're talking about going to you're following the path of the Underground Railroad. That sounds like a really big project. How was that like?
That was really interesting because originally I wanted to follow the steps of the Lewis and Clark expedition. I've always been fascinated with that expedition as a kid, right? Learning about it in school. But when I was doing the research, I was like, let me do the Underground Railroad because I've always been fascinated by the resilience of the people that traveled through the network of the Underground Railroad, not knowing anything or reading the map of this country, but just navigating by following rivers, maybe mountains, maybe stars. And I've always been fascinated how they traveled. So I wanted to, obviously, they traveled by foot and I was by bicycle, but it gave me a sense of the landscape that they had to travel.
For context, could you provide the span of the Underground Railroad and the purpose of it?
Sure. So the Underground Railroad was not a railroad or there's no train. It was a network of houses, network of businesses that freedom seekers, that I call freedom seekers, they were enslaved Africans, would travel to freedom. Most of the time, the railroad went north towards Canada because that's where you became free. But there was also an underground railroad that went to Mexico. But I never traveled that. I focused on a particular route. There's a song called Follow the Drinking Gourd. The Follow the Drinking Gourd was a song, a spiritual song that people, freedom seekers, will sing in plantations. But it wasn't just a song, it was actually a GPS that will say, and you could actually go to YouTube and put Follow the Drinking Gourd and you could analyze that song. But literally it says you follow the Tennessee River to the Ohio River and you follow the Big Dipper into freedom. Oh, wow. And I follow that particular song.
And is that how slaves would traverse, is by following that song? Is that their lyrical roadmap?
That was it. They didn't know how to read. They didn't know the map, the landscape of this country. But they remember that song because they used to sing it. And so most of the time, I would camp right by the river of the Tennessee River, the Ohio River, and into Canada through Buffalo and Niagara Falls.
That's really interesting. It's also really interesting how information can travel, and that everyone picks up on that, and the communities that are centered around that.
Today, there's a place in Canada called Owen Sound, and there's descendant of people that travel through the Underground Railroad, and every year they celebrate their expedition up to freedom.
Wow. And I noticed that you had some photos of you tracing that path. I'm not sure if we had a chance to look through these yet on screen.
Yeah.
But is there any one of them that you'd like to share?
All of them. So I started in New Orleans, and I went to Alabama, Mississippi, and to Kentucky, Tennessee. But in that particular, you will see Tennessee, the welcome sign that says Tennessee. And I would read historical markers along the way. And some of them I knew about them, and some of them I didn't. I will ask local people. I will go to libraries. I will go to historical markers or historical societies, and they will tell me, oh, go over here. That you see where I was traveling through on my bicycle, that one says the gateway to freedom. I knew of that historical marker. Listen, I went there on a Sunday because that was in New Albany, Indiana, and the church let out. And one of the guys said, oh, what are you doing? I said, I'm going from New Orleans to Canada, retracing the Underground Railroad. He said, you know, this church was part of the Underground Railroad. Let me take you inside. And all of a sudden, they took me downstairs to a basement where there was tunnels, that one tunnel that connected to an army hospital where people used to come, nurses used to come and obey the freedom seekers. And there was another tunnel that went into the town of New Albany, and then people disappear with the rest of the town, right? And the rooms, I'm like, wow, this is fascinating.
That's really interesting.
To see historical, like tangible buildings. I got to spend that picture where I'm walking there. That is Ripley, Ohio. One of my goals was I wanted to spend the night at Underground Railroad Station, and that was in Ripley, Ohio. It's called the Rankin House, one of the most popular Underground Railroad stations in the network. Over 5,000 freedom seekers went through that door, and I got to spend the night there. So, yeah, it's just a fascinating. I just learned so much. Look, in 2014, I did that trip, and I was like, I will never do this again.
Really?
It was physically, mentally, and
taxing.
spiritually very hard. But I went back in 2020.
Oh, wow.
And I learned and got to learn more too. So I went there during the pandemic and then during election year.
What's something that you could share about that people don't mention in history books, that you could only get by going there?
Yeah, kind of like what I mentioned, that there were songs that were actually GPS. They weren't just singing to sing. They were GPS on how to navigate, because kind of like what you mentioned, the information will get down to like, hey, travel this route. This is a safe route, or, yeah, that was very interesting to me.
And in terms of spirituality, what were the kind of things that you've kind of uncovered for yourself?
Well, spirituality is like, kind of like when I travel, again, I'm not listening to music, I'm listening to my thoughts, and I'm calling the name of famous, what they call conductors of the Underground Railroad, and I said, show me what happened here. And just like I mentioned, I went to take a picture of a historical marker, and all of a sudden, a guy came out of nowhere and says, hey, what are you up to? You want me to help you? Because I was trying to take a selfie, and he was like, let me help you. What are you up to? I said, I'm just following the Underground Railroad. Oh, you know, this church is part of it. And all of a sudden, I went downstairs. And before we went downstairs, he was like, he opened a trap door. And I said, where are we going? He said, we're going to the Underground Railroad. It happened over and over, experiences like that were not part of my research. All of a sudden, people come out of and said, oh, let me show you. This is part of the Underground Railroad. So it's the reason why every year I go out and travel through history.
Right, yeah. I feel like when one steps away from their default and becomes radio silent within themselves, the universe communicates back, and these opportunities seem to always open up. It seems 100%. To be a constant on these type of travels.
And I'm traveling through a vehicle that is a non-threatening vehicle. Non-threatening to Earth and non-threatening to people. I'm not making a lot of noise. I'm just pedaling through.
Right.
So people just like, oh, let me help you out.
They see the effort that you're putting into it as well. Someone that's willing to weather out the actual weather and just come across people and their concerns for safety. It seems like that's a really great way to connect with others by making yourself vulnerable to them.
I love it. And also respecting, because people always say, what have you learned? I'm going to people's neighborhoods. I'm going to people's towns. I'm just a guest. So I treat myself like that. I'm just a guest.
Right.
Yeah.
And do you have any more photos from the Underground Railroad?
No, that was the last one. I mean, like I mentioned, I don't like to travel with GPS. I like to travel how ancient travelers did with a map, and I just carry that map everywhere. And I get lost a lot, so I eventually I think I am going to go to GPS, because as I get older, I'm like, why did I go 15 miles out of the way? Like,
Sure.
15 miles in a car is no big deal, but on a bike, it's like, now I got to go 15 miles back, you know?
Right.
So the legs are getting tired. Yeah.
Well, if technology is man-made, perhaps.
Yeah, I think I'm going to.
Perhaps it's natural.
For sure.
So from there, you became inspired to do another project, a much bigger project. Can you explain that?
Well, I think I always tell people I have enough projects in my head for 5 lifetimes. So on that trip along the Underground Railroad, I kept asking myself, who were the first people that traveled by bike? I love history since I was a kid. And I was like, who were the first people that traveled by bike? Where did they go, and how did they go? How did they get there? So when I got home, I started doing research. And I found that in 1890s, there was a lot of people traveling by bike. Some in the US, but a lot in Europe. And I started reading and studying their routes. And one day, I want to recreate one of those routes. And then I came across this photo that we have on the slide. And for me, I mean, even telling you now, it's racing my skin, because it was the first time that I saw someone that looked like me traveling by bike. There were 20 black soldiers. This was an experiment. The Army wanted to see if they could use the bicycle as a method of transportation. So these were the Buffalo soldiers, and the Lieutenant Moss, who's the white soldier there, I knew everything about him. I knew where he was born. I knew where he went to school. I knew he graduated last in his class. I knew how he died. I know where he's buried. But I didn't know anything about the black soldiers. I didn't know their names. I didn't know where they died. I didn't know if they were married, if they had kids. And I became fascinated. I wanted to learn more. My wife says I'm obsessed. But I became fascinated because I wanted to learn everything about them. I wanted to know their name. I wanted to know where they died. I know where they're buried. I wanted to know where they're buried. I wanted to know if they had kids. So I just, in 2014, started collecting photos of this particular expedition. They did 3 expeditions.
And so the Buffalo Soldiers, at the time you started, their names weren't available. It wasn't accessible anywhere.
We had the names of every single person on that trip. But what we did not have, as I started collecting all these photos, is I couldn't name what name went with what face.
Gotcha. So there was no indexing as it pertains to all these different media types.
For me, it became kind of sad. Not kind of. It became sad because I said, if that was my great-grandfather, I want the world to know how awesome he was. So potentially there's somebody out there that doesn't know how awesome their ancestor was.
Right.
And I took this project personal.
Okay. And so when it came to the actual photography, you actually had to find those as well? And then once it's almost as if this project of yours is also a giant puzzle, trying to piece together all this information and create a more clearer picture of how history was, and if there's some way to learn more about it.
Exactly. I think I have, if we stayed on this slide that we have now, Can you go that slide? The next two slides that I'm going to show, or we're seeing on the screen, is the synopsis of the trip. So as I mentioned, they did 3 expeditions. One was they were stationed in Fort Missoula, Montana. There was an expedition that was done 130 miles round trip to Lake McDonald. Today it's known as McDonald Lake. Then the second expedition, August 15, they left Fort Missoula, Montana to Yellowstone. And within Yellowstone Park, they rode 200 miles and back. That was recorded as 800 miles. This is single speed bikes, no gears. Their wheels were made out of wood. They're wooden wheels. In 1897, the Army says, this is pretty good. Let's go a little further. Their last expedition was from Fort Missoula, Montana to St. Louis, Missouri. 1,900 miles, 41 days, and they only took 2 days off.
And so this is new technology for the country.
They were, for that time, the most modern bikes available.
And they haven't really been field tested. So these soldiers are the ones who are field testing these equipment. And, you know, like us today, we have roads, we have, you know, durable tires, we have everything where we can travel fairly easily. For that didn't exist at all at that time. And that in itself kind of had to be documented. It's like, I'm on this bike in this terrain.
Correct.
And I'm getting injured from it, and I want to do that. Or, you know, what's the lifespan of this bike? I don't know if I'm going to get to point A to point B. So there's all these questions that that the Buffalo soldiers have to answer, and then eventually give us that science for us.
Correct. And for me, luckily, because it was done by the Army, everything was so well documented. Now, as you mentioned, it's a puzzle, so I had to figure out where this documentation was. But this particular, what we're seeing is the 1896 expedition that was done to Yellowstone, and the other slide is the 1897 expedition. And I have literally everything from the date that they left, the miles that they covered, the weather pattern, conditions of the road. So when I traveled through history, especially this one, I wanted to travel the day that they traveled. So they started June 14 of 1897 out of Fort Missoula, Montana at 5:30 in the morning. 125 years later, on June 14 of 2022 at 5:30 in the morning, I left from the same location that they left. And because I had a journal that told me exactly where they camp, ate, I just followed them mile by mile.
Wow, so you created this virtual experience for yourself.
I wanted to see the climate, the weather condition, the road condition, and I wanted to compare that to my expedition.
Right. And what did you learn from that?
That they don't make men like they used to.
Okay. What does that mean?
These guys were really strong. I mean, someone asked me recently, how come I didn't do it on a single speed? And my response was, as strong of a rider that I am, I couldn't do it. And I also wanted to enjoy my trip. So I didn't do it on a single speed. But
and how old were they?
They were, you have to understand, potentially their parents were enslaved, maybe. I'm not sure yet. Some of them were. That I know. So they wanted to show that they were created, that their motivation was, and I'm maybe speaking for them, but they wanted to show that they were equal to other men. So I'm surprised that no one died on this expedition. That's how harsh it was, and still is.
Right.
26 years later, it's hard. There was a couple of times early on that I was like, oh man, if it wasn't that I'm retracing history, I probably would have packed up my bike and I would have gone home.
Okay.
Yeah.
I really want to get into the psychology of these men. Like, how were they chosen, and how old were they when they were chosen?
Very good question. So it's documented that most of them were between 24 to 27 years old. there was one guy who was the oldest person of the expedition. His name is Sergeant Mingo Sanders, and Mingo Sanders was 39 years old. He was the oldest person in that expedition. But that right there, that map is the original map of that expedition where they went from Fort Missoula, Montana to St. Louis. And that line in the middle that you see, they were following a railroad track, actually two railroad tracks. One was the Northern Pacific Railroad track and the Burlington Railroad track. Why they needed the railroad track is that they had enough supplies for 2 days. Lieutenant Moss wanted to cover 50 miles every single day because that way they were able to compete with the horse and show the Army that it was a successful expedition. So every 100 miles, every 2 days, the Army would drop off at different stations, tires, chains, food. Very, very harsh expedition. And in the middle, Nebraska, there's a shaded area in Nebraska. The Sand Hills of Nebraska is documented as being the toughest part of that expedition because a lack of water and the terrain. So most of those guys were drinking water from farmers, from the same water well where cattle were drinking.
Right.
And a lot of them got sick in Nebraska.
And so for this toughness, did they receive military training?
No. Only 4 of them knew how to ride bikes out of 20. Most of them had to learn within a week.
Okay. So were they enlisted men prior, or they were enlisted to become Buffalo Soldiers?
So they were enlisted. An interesting thing, it was a volunteer expedition.
Okay.
So, and it was volunteer in the sense of Lieutenant Moss had 40 men. Out of 40 men, he handpicked 20 for this expedition. And they thought, why not? Because it might be better life than doing the chores at the fort, right? Like cleaning bathrooms and things like that.
That feels very relatable in the sense that we have very little options, but there's no option that's worse than where we're at now.
Correct.
And so to be able to just like stair-step our way out of that situation, it seems like they turned to bicycle as the option, and then becoming the Buffalo Soldiers for the country to test these bikes. But also, were they involved in combat?
No, not at this time. They weren't involved in combat.
Okay.
The research that I found, none of these guys were. Now, prior to the 1897, they were not. Now, there was a 4th expedition that never happened. It was supposed to go from Fort Missoula, Montana to San Francisco. But in 1898, the Spanish War broke out, and most of these guys were shipped to Cuba to fight. So the project died.
That's really interesting. And so you said they've done 4 projects total?
They did 3. The 4th never happened.
So the 4th didn't happen.
Yeah.
What were basically the mission statements for each of those projects?
They were very successful. They wanted to continue. The Army thought that it was, all the expeditions were very successful, well documented. A lot of European countries actually had bicycle corps, but the U.S. never adopted the bicycle corps. See that picture here currently on the slide? You will see they will use the railroad to navigate because they didn't have the roads that we have today, right? They were not paved. They were muddy, gravel, really hard to navigate. So sometimes if it rained, they would just get on the railroad track to continue. Again, Lieutenant Moss wanted to cover 50 miles every single day, regardless of what happened. The next slide, which is probably the slide, the photo that I love the most, because I'm able to see their faces as I'm trying to figure out who's who. I'm able to see if I recognize them. I love the buildings in the background, so that particular building with the triangle became pretty interesting to me. And if you go to the next slide, when I got to that town, that's Livingston, Montana, I got to find that same building from that same spot that they took that photo, and I recreated that guy standing there. Yeah, it's just traveling through history. The next slide, I was in Helena, Montana. I went to Fort Harrison. The interesting thing about this experience that I'm going to tell you is that prior to me leaving on this expedition, I called them almost every single week. And I said, I want to stay at your fort because the Buffalo Soldiers, the Bicycle Corps, stayed here twice. When they went through to Yellowstone and then when they went to St. Louis. So for me, it's very important to stay exactly where they stayed, if I could. And they were like, you're not military. You can't. So when I got there, I went to a museum. They have a military museum. So I wanted to see, when I traveled through history, I stopped at libraries, historical societies, to see if I could find a photo or some type of documentation that I don't have. I didn't see anything, not even one photo at this museum. So I was just like, I'm gonna leave. And as I'm leaving, there was a lady waving at me. And I'm like, who is this lady? But I'm waving back. And she said, wait. She crossed the street and she said, you're the guy that is retracing the Bicycle Corps. I just saw you on the news. How can I help you? Or what can I do for you? And I said, I would love to stay at this fort. And she said, I'm probably the only person that could authorize that. I'm the colonel of this fort. There's nobody higher than this lady. And I'm able, and it's interesting, similar to the Underground Railroad where when I'm riding my bike, I'm talking to the names of those guys. I'm calling Private John Finley, Mingo Sanders, Elwood Foreman, tell me what happened here. And then all of a sudden, this lady appears and says, what can I do? I said, I want to stay here. She said, I can make it. Made a call, and within 2 minutes, I had a place where I stayed, which was the same place where they stayed.
Right, that's awesome. The universe opens up again. And it's also you're taking that leap of faith, just like family members telling you, are you crazy? And getting
and I may be.
Getting pushback. But the idea of always having pushback, but still gracefully pushing through that, until ultimately you do find your answer, even though to do so would also require a leap of faith. You're willing to take that.
100%.
That, to me, is a strong symbol of being an adventurer.
Yeah, I think it's to do adventure, you have to have that faith because you never know what's on the other side. Right. And every adventurer goes through it, and then you adapt because that's your only choice.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not easy a lot of the times, but it's very rewarding. What were the challenges that you encountered while going through and tracing the path of the Buffalo Soldiers?
Every day there was a challenge, especially in Montana and parts of Wyoming where I'm camping in places that have grizzly bears. And so that takes a toll in my head, right? Constantly thinking about, am I going to wake up? Am I doing the right thing? Is my food away? You know what I mean? Like
right.
Constantly. Someone was killed a few years ago in one of the towns that I went through, and for some reason, everyone wanted to tell me that story. Oh, when you get to Ovando, someone was killed last summer. I didn't want to hear that, right? So those mentally dealing with grizzly bears, I think was hard in that part of the country. Also, in parts of Wyoming, you can't figure out if the road is public or if it's private. So sometimes I'm riding my bike, I go 5 miles in, and there's a guy comes out, is like, you're not allowed to be here. And I just didn't know that it was a private road. So now I have to go 5 miles back and figure it out how to. So that takes a toll too, right? I'm like, oh my God, I can't keep doing this. Going 5 miles in, 5 miles back, and then figure out. So it's not just a bike ride. I'm trying to stay as close as possible to where they went.
Right. So on this trip and all the information that you've gathered, is there pieces of history that you discovered for yourself that aren't recorded anywhere?
No, but in a particular town called Gillette, Wyoming, there was a newspaper article that I did not have, and one of the historians gave it to me, and it's very interesting because so that picture that I show you that I recreated, when I got to that town, I asked someone if they could take that picture because all I had was my iPhone. That photo has been around for 125 years, so I want an actual camera that could take that photo. So maybe my photo could inspire the next generation of bicycle travelers, right? And the guy was like, I can't take that photo. I said, why not? He said, there's a shadow in front of you. I was like, just take the photo, dude. And he says, you got to come back tomorrow. Come back between 12 and 2 o'clock. I said, there's no way I could come back tomorrow because the expedition moves on. If I take a day off where they didn't take a day off, I have to ride 100 miles to catch up with them. He said, you want the photo or you don't? I said, I do. So the following day, I had to ride 106 miles to a town called Gillette, Wyoming. When I get to this town, there was a museum that wanted me to do a talk about my experience and their experience, and I did it. But the following day that was June 28th. On June 29th, I decided I needed to take another day off. I was mentally tired, physically tired. I haven't spoken to my wife. I needed to take a shower. I needed to do laundry. I'm like, you know what? I'll catch up with them. And I'm reading their journal, and I knew that before. I knew that also they started doing less miles into Nebraska and Wyoming and Missouri. So I was like, I'll catch up eventually. So I took a day off, and I went to a hotel. And around 1:30, there was a hailstorm that happened. I was like, oh man, I'm glad that I wasn't out there. And if you've been in Wyoming, once you leave a town, you're in God's country, and like those balls would have hit me, right? So I'm like, oh, I'm so glad I didn't go. And then I get a text from that historian of that museum. He says, I got something to show you. And he texts me an article that was written on June 29 of 1897, which says that on that particular day, the same location, Gillette, Wyoming, they also had a hailstorm.
Oh, fun.
And I didn't have that in my research. Wow. And that's the beauty of traveling, because sometimes you could do a whole store, you could have everything lined up.
Yeah.
But the local people, they know more.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that I met him and I have that. And he was like, dude, you know, he texted me, he's like, someone is looking after you.
Right.
That you took a day off. They dealt with hailstorm, but you didn't. So that was nice.
Wow, what an experience. And so at the end of your project, what kind of things can you share about that? What conclusions did you find, or did you achieve the amount of information that you wanted to gather and collect?
All I wanted to do was retrace that route. But this story has so many layers. Like I mentioned, we have the names of every soldier, but yet we can't put a face with the name. About 3 years ago, I started working with some historians, and we're able to figure out 9 of them. So there's 11 of them that I don't know who they are. The beauty of it is that I met 2 descendants of those guys, separate. So that was beautiful to be able to meet. I know so much about these guys and be able to meet someone that is close to. I met a descendant from the oldest rider of that expedition, Sergeant Mingo Sanders. Another layer is that I wanted to know where they were born, where they died, and where they're buried. Very important to me. I wanted to give them the dignity that was not given to them while they were alive. And now I'm able to figure out where each member is buried.
Oh, wow.
And when I discovered that, there's a few of them that did not have a grave marker. And the slide that we're looking at, he is the mechanic of the expedition. His name is Private John Finley. Private John Finley, without him, I don't think they wouldn't have been able to do this expedition. He was, while most of the guys were sleeping, all the guys were sleeping, he was out there working at night, making sure that each bike was ready to go in the morning. So I found where he was buried, and he didn't have a grave marker. 3 years ago, we started working with the VA to make sure that he got a proper grave marker, and we placed one about 2 years ago, and he's buried in Arlington Cemetery in Chicago. And I got to see it last year. I went to Chicago to see the grave marker. I'm working on a second cyclist from that expedition that also does not have a grave marker, and one of the things I want to do is making sure that each of them has a grave marker, and we pay honor to them, because they inspire me, and they will inspire the next generation of explorers, adventurers that look like me.
Right.
So it's proper for me that everyone is able to recognize them by face and name, similar to what we do with the white soldier. His name is James Moss. We should be able to recognize the black soldiers as well.
So you're giving representation to those that are misrepresented or underrepresented, and putting it out there for someday people who are interested, just like how you were interested, will be able to find the inspiration as you've had, and then through that find the strength, and then grow from there. And then as you have these new growths happening, more contribution, whether it's through knowledge or just adding value to other people's lives, it builds strength upon itself. And it seems like for you collecting this data, you're giving a person a starting point or a node to be able to start from and then build from.
I mean, I'm inspired by my son, and hopefully he wants to discover the world by bicycle as well, hopefully.
Right.
And make it easier for him, have it, it'd be more normal for him to do that. And so not only my son, but everybody else's sons too.
And do you feel what you've done has given him more agency for travel?
Yeah. But he's only 3 years old.
But once he wants to, put on the shoes and tie his laces and
But he's discovering Santa Monica like an explorer,
Right.
Yeah.
And that's key, just having that agency to do that, knowing that he can do that if he wanted to.
Yeah.
It's available to him. That's important.
Very important.
So are there any more photos from?
No, from that expedition, that was it. The next few slides are random pictures from places all around the country that I travel, but then, and then it's the new project the next slide is the current project that I'm working on.
Well, tell us about this. Tell us about your next project.
Again, I thought, man, I have so many projects in my head. What's next? I've always been fascinated by Matthew Henson, a member of the Explorers Club, and Matthew Henson became the first African-American explorer inducted into the club in 1936. And 2 years ago, I met a descendant at the club of Matthew Henson, and I was like, I want to learn more about him. I knew a few stories about Matthew Henson, but since then I read his biography, and now I'm doing the work that similar to what I did with the Bicycle Corps is I want to learn more about this guy and how he ended up in the North Pole, and how come I didn't learn about him when I was a kid in middle school, high school, or even college, right? Because if I would have seen that, I probably would have got interested in polar exploration.
Right.
Like I am today. I wish I would have, so I feel cheated, right, that I didn't learn this. And for me, it's important because once you walk around the hallways of museums, of places that encourage exploration and adventure, and if you don't see yourself, it's like, am I welcome to go to the North Pole?
Right.
Because I've never seen anybody that looked like me in the North Pole. But Matthew Henson was up there in 1909, the top of the world. So I want to go where he went.
Right.
So potentially, and I said potentially is because we're working on it. In April of 2025, we're hoping to get up to the North Pole.
So less than a year.
Less than a year.
And you've become acquainted with being cold. I see you have a photo here.
Yeah, my friend who's sitting right there, he took that photo in honor of that historical photo of Matthew Henson. And the next few slides are photos from that original expedition of 1909 to the North Pole. And you could share those photos as well.
And there's some controversy about who actually was the first to be recorded at being at the North Pole. Can you go into a little about that?
Yeah, I don't know if I could go deep into it, but there was a few people that said they went to the North Pole first. On this expedition, Matthew Henson was not the leader of the expedition. It was Robert Peary. And they went up there, or tried to go up to the North Pole. They had about 6 expeditions that went up there. Sometimes they made it up to Greenland and they couldn't go further. But in 1909, April 6th of 1909, they made it up to the North Pole. Now there's a few things that happened. Robert Peary had frozen bites in his toes. He lost 9 of them, actually. So it was hard for him to walk. There's documented that he got about 45 minutes to the North Pole and couldn't walk anymore. So he stayed in the tent. Matthew Henson, with 4 Inuits, natives of that area of Greenland, continue. And at some point, with the instruments that they had at the time, Matthew Henson says, I'm the first person on top of the world. So he went back and told Robert Peary that they had made it. And Robert Peary said, when we go back to the United States, you can't take credit for this. I'll take all credit. So when he came back, Robert Peary was given parades, money, medals, books, tours, made a lot of money. And Robert Peary told Matthew Henson, you can't write a book, you can't do a tour. So Matthew Henson actually died kind of poor. He worked in New York City at the custom office. But yeah, to me it's sad, right, that he wasn't, because of what the country was then, he couldn't get that credit.
Right.
But eventually, people said, there's no way that Robert Peary made it. So they figured things out. Robert Peary died, and then 30 years later, the Explorers Club welcomed Matthew Henson to the club. And so, yeah, I find it fascinating, and I want to learn more about it. So I want to retrace that route. Now, we couldn't do the route the way they did it back then. I mean, things are changing. Potentially, like my son, if he ever wants to go to the North Pole, I'm not sure if he's going to be able to. It's getting warmer up there. The window of exploration for the North Pole is closing. The way they travel, I couldn't retrace it that way.
Right.
Because they went by land through Greenland. So, yeah.
And so from one soldier, now you're forming an all-black team to go to the North Pole, how many people will be on your team?
There's 8.
8. And so the system is changing, and you're making an influence on how that system will change.
Well, Matthew Henson made that change. We're just following his steps. But without him, I don't know if the North Pole to me was never a bucket list. I have many bucket lists, but the North Pole wasn't one. But because he showed me the blueprint, now I want to go up there. And I've done several training, now 2-year training, and the next slides are all training that we have done in northern Minnesota, kind of by Winnipeg. There's a lake called Lake of the Woods. And the reason that area is chosen is because it's very similar with the ice formation, the weather pattern of the North Pole. Now, last year was negative 20 degrees. The North Pole gets to negative 60. But that was the coldest we have trained. We have another training in January, and then again, potentially going up to the North Pole through Siberia, hopefully. I mean, there's a small window when you could travel up to the North Pole, and we may be in Siberia for like a month. And if we're able to make it, we'll go up to the North Pole, so we're hoping.
Wow, that's really interesting. In the beginning, you were indexing others' achievements. Now you're creating your own achievements that will itself be indexed. So before we go to questions, is there anything else that you want to mention about your upcoming trip or anything in general?
I think we covered everything. It hasn't been released out that we're going to go, but in the next few days, it will be released, so you'll see it through social medias and things like that. I mean, to take 8 people on a trip like that, financially, it's a lot of money. The equipment, training. So we're working potentially with grants, maybe brands. We're still trying to figure out how we finance this, but.
Okay, I'd love to learn more about that.
Yeah, once I have more information, I'll share with you for sure.
Well, great, thank you. So at this time, we'll open up the questions to the audience.
If you have a question, raise your hand. Craig, okay.
That was a great talk.
Thank
Super inspirational. I
Thank
got a little teary-eyed a couple of times. Really, really powerful. I have a sort of a technical question. I've done a lot of touring, and I've never seen anybody have bags on the front of their bike. They're always on the back. Can you talk about the rig? Because it looked like you had an incredibly light rig for that kind of touring.
That's very insightful of you. It didn't start like that. I have used rear panniers. I have used all 4 panniers. In the past few years, I have tried to go as light as possible. Maybe 25 pounds is the lightest I've gone. And when I go off-road, and the Bicycle Core project was about 70% off-road, I like to go with front pannier. I feel like when I go downhill or uphill, my wheels are grounded on the gravel, and I prefer that. I don't know if one is better than other. I know that in the back, I have broken spokes before, not many, 1 or twice. Now I've always wondered, like, is it because you have your weight is in the back tire, but then you added more weight? So that's why I move it to the front. But also, seeing pictures from way back in 1890s, that's how they had it too. So I just mimicking what they did. I don't know if it's smart or not, but it's working for me. Yeah.
Other questions?
So I read a Smithsonian article on this bicycle trip, and I understand this infantry division, or the guys who did the ride, also went off and not just fought in Cuba, but were in the same battle that Teddy Roosevelt gets famous for the Hill. And then I read that Sergeant Mingo.
Don't make me
gets
cry.
shot.
Yeah.
I'm almost afraid to ask about that. but can you tell us about their experience in combat and what they did to the sergeant?
Yeah. Like I mentioned, there's layers to this story, and the more I go in, I'm like, oh my God, now this. So in 1898, they went to Cuba. When they came back, and they fought next to the Rough Riders. As a matter of fact, there was a story that says that the Rough Riders and Theodore Roosevelt met Mingo Sander, who was in charge of the black platoon, and the Rough Riders, Teddy's guys, had ran out of food. So Teddy says, you have to share half of your rations with our platoon. And they did that. When they came back to the States, some of them went to Missoula, Montana, and some of them were sent to Brownsville, Texas. Mingo Sanders was one of them. Remember I said in 1897 he was 39 years old? When he went back to, when he came back from Cuba and went to Brownsville, Texas, and you could Google this, in Brownsville, Texas, there was an incident in 1906 where a bartender was killed and a police officer was hurt, and the residents of the town blamed the Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers had nothing to do with it. 2 years later, they were cleared by the Texas Court of Law. Now, somehow, there was a botch investigation. I say botch because an investigation went all the way up to the White House. At the time, Theodore Roosevelt now is president. And Theodore Roosevelt asked the platoon if they had any part of that killing of the bartender. And they were like, no. Even the officers were like, our soldiers were in the barracks. Teddy Roosevelt decided to dishonorable discharge the whole platoon. 161 men were left without providing for their family. Mingo Sanders was 3 months from retiring. And he wrote a letter. I read the letter that he wrote to Teddy Roosevelt and says, I fought next to you in Cuba. Don't do this. I'm 3 months from retiring and I want pension. 3 months from retiring, did not receive pension. And the whole platoon, 160 men were, and that is why I'm discovering that some of these men did not have grave markers. Some of them were sent to Brownsville, some of them were sent to Missoula. Now, the guys in Missoula, they all have grave markers, but not the guys from Brownsville. Which, out of Brownsville, there was 5 of the riders from the Bicycle Corps. So, yeah, sad, very sad.
Okay, back here. Are we,
Much less heavy of a question. 2 parts. Going back to the bicycle ride, the Buffalo Soldiers, you said that they wanted 50 miles a day.
50.
And then I wanted to ask how much of that was off-road with these sorts of bikes? And then the second part of that is what happened with malfunctions with the bikes? Did they ever run into situations where they had to split up, or I don't know, how did they deal with the situation of, I don't know, it's not that they had a supply vehicle there that had an extra bike if something broke down, so what happened in situations where they had to deal with what happens to the guy who doesn't have a bike?
Very good question. I'll try to answer all of them. So back then, there was no roads like what we have today. There was no paved road. All of that was dirt road. And the gravel changes by state. It's kind of weird. Sometimes it was muddy. Sometimes it was like the sandhills of Nebraska was really tough. So it was really hard to navigate. There were single speed bicycles. It's interesting because I read the journal of Sergeant Mingo Sander that says he weighted everyone before and after. And all the guys gained weight, but we believe it was muscle weight because they had to push their bikes a lot. Usually, you lose weight. I usually lose 10 to 15 pounds on a trip like that. you gain it back within a week. But malfunction, they had, as a team, they have 15 flat tires, and there was malfunction almost every single day. Luckily, there was a mechanic of the expedition, John Finley, and he always had those bikes ready in the morning. He would sleep. That's why I love that guy. I'm like, while everyone was sleeping, he was working on those bikes. He would sleep like 3 hours, 4 hours, and always work on bikes. Sometimes he didn't have all the tools. There was a couple of times that he used a fork as a spoke. He would just be very creative, like a Mike Wire kind of guy. But the Army would drop off wheels, spokes, chains. The interesting thing is reported that as a unit, they had a whole bike. Someone had a frame, someone had spokes, someone had tires. So, and any chance, anything like that happened, they could build a bike together. Yeah.
Great.
One more, we got one more here.
Steve.
Eric, fantastic.
Thank you, Steve.
Incredible talk.
Thank
Like you said, very inspiring. I have a couple questions. As a nothing bike rider compared to you, you said you never, I want to make sure I understand this, you never ever listen to music, headphones, earbuds, nothing? So what did you think about 10, 12 hours every day?
Imagine that, like you go within and you just start uncovering all kinds of stuff that happened as a kid, things that you want to accomplish. Sometimes I think about my mom who passed away in 1993, who inspired me to be the person I am today. I just go through different thoughts. Sometimes I think about the next cookie that I'm going to eat. Sometimes and sometimes I don't think about anything, and I love that, when there's no thought in my head.
So at any time you never wanted to hear music?
No, because more for safety, Steve, because I'm traveling through places that I've never traveled before. So I want to make sure that I listen to the road. Because sometimes I am on the road. Sometimes I'm on the gravel in Nebraska where there's tractors coming. If you have music, I think it's the only reason why I'm still alive, being able to tell you, because there were so many places I'm like, ooh, that was kind of sketchy. But I'm so glad that I don't listen. I'm just constantly focusing on noises and focus on my project.
Your awareness. And my second question is, you said how difficult the first underground railroad excursion was for you, but yet you did it a second time. So tell us why you did it a second time.
Yeah. On a bicycle, you could only go but so far, and I kept a journal of places that I wanted to go, but I'm like, oh, I don't know if I could go 50 miles that way and then 50 miles back. And you see what I'm saying? Like on a car, it's so easy to go 50 miles and then back. But on a bike, it's like, nah, I'm not going that way. But I do want to hear, and I do want to see what's out there. It'll just be next time, right? So that's why I went back. And I travel pretty much the same route. And after 2020, I was like, I'm not going back again. But now I'm itching again to go back, because there's other places that I like to. And I usually don't like to travel the same route, but there's so much history and that, yeah, that's why I went back.
Eric, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was very inspiring. You're a member of the Explorers Club. It'd be great. Want to visit the Adventurers Club again, and hopefully consider being a member here as well.
I would love that. It would be an honor. I live in Santa Monica, and to be an honor of such a prestigious club would be, again, a highlight of my life and my career.
Oh, thank you. I think it would be great to have you here.
Thank you.
And for everyone at home, thank you for watching. We're here every week. Feel free to come by every Thursday. We're happy to have you. Have a good night.